Good afternoon from Europe. Good morning, good evening to those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world, and welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture Growing Pains webinar. This is the third in the series that we at Practical Action have been running with IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative. We've been bringing together companies from all parts of the value chain, those who are directly working with farmers, those who are traders, aggregators, the large brands selling us the products that we buy on our shelves, and the retailers to discuss how their people are already working towards regenerative agriculture practices and what it will take to get to greater scale. So we're going to share some learning from the previous two sessions, and we've got a fantastic panel who are going to discuss a range of challenges and opportunities they see in terms of getting to the next level. I know we've got a really great audience today as well, and we're talking systems change, we're talking transformation of our food and farming systems. None of us have all the answers, but I think with the combination of the panel and the audience that we have, there's a huge amount of experience and expertise in this virtual room, and I would really encourage you to introduce yourselves on the chat, say a little bit about where you're working and what you're working on. Do put your insights and experience and questions up as we go. And then we can make sure that we try and address some of those as we go through and bring some of the experience in the wider room to bear as well. So before I introduce our panel, we're going to just start with a short video to frame the discussion. Thanks.
Foods and jobs for billions of people, but the system is failing. Farming makes a huge contribution to man-made climate change. Now, for the first time, a consensus is growing that the way we get our food is not working for people or the planet. And there is a better way. The moment has come to create sustainable ways of growing food that work with the environment, rehabilitate land, and create supply chains that support consumers, farmers, and their communities. For 55 years, Practical Action has proven, from the lake basins of Kenya to the cloud forests of the Amazon and the flooded coasts of Asia, that big change is possible. That regenerative agriculture led by people won't just reduce climate impacts. It can improve biodiversity, restore soil health, reduce hunger, and help farmers cope with the challenges they face. But while we know what's required, transforming an entire system and achieving scale will take everyone who grows, delivers, and produces food to work together to solve one of the world's toughest problems. At Practical Action, we want to mobilize more people than ever to address the problems in the current food system. So that's what we're doing.
So I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Tessa Mergerstein. I work for IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, as the Senior Program Manager for the coffee team, but I'm also responsible for the regenerative agriculture strategy within IDH. IDH is an organization that really promotes sustainable trade, and we really work towards what we call better incomes, better jobs, and better environment. And we really see regenerative agriculture as a way in which that all comes together. So it actually is for us a concept that really helps to bring together the different parts of sustainability that we're looking at. And it would be, actually, it's a very nice way to really think at it as a holistic system. As IDH, we also work a lot in cooperation. So we can't do it alone. We really try to build coalitions for transitions. And again, RegenEg is a great way to go about that. So for today, I would say we want to talk a bit about how do we enable that transition, recognizing that that can't be done at a farm scale only, at a supply chain scale only, but needs to be done in collaboration. And for that reason, we've invited 2 other guests, which I will quickly ask to introduce themselves as well. So first we have Martina Henry, who's, if I say correctly, the head of RegenEg at Diageo. So Martina, can I please ask you to introduce a bit what RegenEg within Diageo means and yourself?
Thanks, Tessa. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And thanks to Practical Action for having me join the panel today. As Tessa said, I lead our global regenerative agriculture work at Diageo, which is on a journey, it's fair to say. I've been with the company 5 years and really been developing and scaling our sustainable agriculture program during that time. And just last year, we launched our new 2030 ambition, which sets out some very clear goals and targets that we have with respect to regenerative agriculture, and really looking to understand how that shows up in the different sourcing landscapes that we're engaged with. Because we recognise that whilst perhaps there has been an historic approach that has been crop and location agnostic with regards to sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture is clearly dependent on the cropping system, the farming region, and the type of landscape that we're working in. So it's a really exciting time for us as a company, as we really embrace our part in the food system. And I think regenerative agriculture for me is very much one of the pillars, and there are several that we need to really pull in order to deliver on the ambition of the SDGs. And I suppose avoid the catastrophic social and environmental issues that we're seeing already come to the fore. So I'll hand over to Martine, and we can hopefully get Sarah back to get into questions after that.
Thanks, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening wherever you are. Very happy to be here. My name is Martina Jansen. I work for Rabobank, and within Rabobank, I work for Project Acorn, which is a new initiative where we focus on measuring and then monetizing and marketing the carbon sequestered at smallholder agroforestry plots to generate an additional income stream for smallholder farmers. And the reason that we've established this new proposition is that we strongly believe in the importance of agroforestry for smallholder farmers for multiple reasons around the fact that it increases the quality of the soil, the quality and diversity of nutrients, water levels, and increases resilience of the smallholder farmers. We think that is very important, and that should be the reason farmers are making a transition to agroforestry. However, we also think it's important to generate an additional income stream to make that transition more financially sustainable. And that is where this proposition comes in, whereby we are hoping to connect smallholder farmers to the voluntary carbon market more easily, reducing cost and increasing the price of the carbon removal units, as we call them, by making them very traceable and standardized. That is an additional layer, but obviously something that is only one aspect of it. So by definition, in order to make this work, we need to work together with other parties in the value chain, which we definitely are doing as well, and hope to share a little bit more about that. Very excited to be here and discuss what can be done together with other parties to further scale regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. Thanks.
Right.
I think what I will do is I'll step in for Sarah. I'm Ian Derbyshire from Practical Action. Sorry we're having technical problems here. We've heard a little bit from Tessa and from Martine and from Martina. Tessa, maybe can I come back to you in that case, just to maybe you could give us a sense of where you are as IDH in this whole conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm quite with Martina as saying it's a journey. We're stepping onto that journey, and the first steps for us have been to look at what does it mean, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, what do we talk about, and then where do we see a role for IDH as an organization. And what is incredibly important for us, what I alluded to a bit earlier as well, is that regenerative agriculture, it's an outcome-based system. It's soil central, but it has to take into account things like farmer income as well. So it can't be in isolation. It really has to be about the full farm system. So taking that as a starting point, then we need to look at how do you get there, right? And I think we're all aware of the issues that we see, particularly with smallholder farming systems where IDH works most. So that was our starting point. And from that, we started looking at, okay, so how then do we enable that transition? And if you currently look at it, you see that there is very few cases with real data that support the transition. So we started actually by looking at, are there success cases? What do they look like? And then what should you focus on? And there are a few, but there's really not a lot out of there. So it starts with having enough data, but having enough data means you have to go through that transition already. So that's one thing. I think the second thing, which is really important, is the timescales that we're looking at. So from the modeling exercise that we did, you see that there actually is a business case for farmers. Generally, there can be a business case for supply chains as well, for offtake. But there's a few important underlying things. And one of that is that in the beginning years, you very often see actually quite some costs have to be made. There is a need, regenerative agriculture farming systems tend to be more complex than monocropping systems. So you need a lot more resource also in terms of knowledge, in terms of time, that is not always supported to the farmers. So it is more complex and it takes time to get there. But then if you look on a longer scale, typically 10 to 15 years, you see that there is a business case. So that is an interesting given. And then what IDH looks at is how do we enable that transition under those circumstances? And that can be many different things. It can be through building coalitions, which I think we'll get back to at both landscape scales, but also at supply chain scale. It's about building that enabling environment, for example, through blended service delivery. So service delivery not only for the focus crop of a supply chain, but actually for a farm system, linking that to offtake and maybe coalitions around offtake. And then finally, investment, where I'm sure that Martina will also talk a bit about that, but how can blended finance enable those transitions for those long-term timescales? And how do we look at risk for all the partners within that transition? So IDH really hopes to build the coalitions, to share the learnings, to enable those transitions and make them much more tangible.
That's great. Thank you, Tessa. Thank you. Maybe Martina, can I come back to you? And we talked there about kind of collaborations and what kind of sort of organizations are you working with at the moment? And are the businesses, with government, sector-wide platforms? And what are the kind of pros and cons of that approach that you're adopting right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think traditionally we haven't been at the fore, as if you were to compare us to a lot of the leaders out there in terms of agriculture specifically. I think we've lots of ambition to really step into that space now moving forward, and have really gone through a bit of a transition ourselves, understanding that we're part of a food system as an alcohol beverage company. It's not always a direct link. So that's been something that we've gone on, but we've absolutely embraced the need to do that at a collaborative level. We're quite active members of SciPlatform, Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, and I've been working through a new working group. I say new, it's been going for over a year, but it was created to really specifically look at regenerative agriculture. And to Tessa's point, I guess sustainable agriculture has been very much practice focused, whereas what we really need to shift to is an outcome focused and a much more granular, nuanced application, and that will differ in all farming systems, and we can't just apply a one size fits all anymore. And I think that's the inherent challenge that we have, because it takes a lot more effort to be able to understand, in the first instance, to define what does regenerative agriculture mean for those different farming systems and for those different farmers, and which levers will work and which will drive the outcomes. And then there's a bit of a gap, I think, at the moment in terms of the measurement tools as well. How do we actually assess what the outcomes are? There's a lot of work happening in the background to catch up on that. But just yesterday, SciPlatform released to the membership our version 0 of our regenerative agriculture framework that we've been working on as a collaborative group. And the intention of that is that it's sort of very first sort of iteration of a framework that we can now as a membership go out and test with some partners in different sort of systems, so that we can feed back then what works, what doesn't within those systems, and get a more granular viewpoint in terms of what's appropriate and what isn't. And the intention being that we'll then release that more publicly, I think, in the new year. So that's one really kind of pivotal, I suppose, collaboration for us. But I do think that actually, as we embrace more of this, we have to think much more laterally about the types of collaborations that we look to. We have the very traditional ones with some fabulous partners like Rabobank and IDH that do great work in the space. There's also the Solidaridad and Technoserves who do practical work on the ground. But actually, if we look at circular economy principles and think about how do we actually look beyond just the biosphere and actually engage with partners on the technosphere to develop industrial symbiosis solutions that really help support that transition right across the economy. I think there's some really exciting potential projects that we're looking at. Some of my great colleagues internally in Diageo are spearheading that work, so I won't take their glory, but I think that's some of the things that we have to start thinking about is beyond our traditional approaches if we really want to drive the scale and impact that we're hoping for.
Okay. And what about we've talked about scale a little bit, will be interesting. Do you have a sense of kind of some of the time frames to support the transition based on key factors like plot size and soil conditions and climate and water access, for example?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the challenge. As Tessa pointed out, you don't get the results in years 1, 2, or 3. That really is a longer term approach. And we're looking in some parts of the world where we have a strong presence, Africa being the sort of historic market that we've worked in quite closely with farmers. But actually, I think to get to that point, we also have to look at our procurement sort of approach and really, in the short term at least, shorten supply chains so that we can more effectively reach those farmers that that are within our supply chain and we're impacting. I think there's also a parallel approach though, which is looking at the wider industry so that we can raise all boats and really look to the regulatory framework that supports that and the voluntary standards that can help bring along that change over time. But it's certainly not, again, you've got big commercial farmers who will do it one way, who perhaps have access to the mechanization that is needed in some cases. And I think the other challenge in the smallholder context is how do we bring them on that journey whilst leapfrogging some of those incumbent problems that more commercialized farms have had in terms of fossil fuel based mechanization or over application of agrochemicals. How do we really take regenerative to help support that economic viability of smallholders as well, and understanding the other constraints. And I think there is a huge opportunity there, but notwithstanding lots of challenges on the way, which is, I guess, why we're here today.
It is indeed. Maybe Martine, can I turn to you now? What in terms of kind of collaborations, what's your perspective on this? Where do you stand? What do you see in the pros and cons and some of the key opportunities there?
Well, there's major opportunities and there's also a strong need for us. we are one of the players, meaning that we can only do that when there is a strong agroforestry. We're specifically talking about agroforestry implementing party that works with the farmers. And to your point, or the points that you were discussing, we also see that there's such a variety, right? So ensuring that there's a local partner that can help farmers in ensuring that the agroforestry design makes sense is super critical. When we start a project, meaning when we start to assess, can we work together to create access to the voluntary carbon market and sell carbon removal units on behalf of the farmers, we always start with a business case to kind of assess, does this make sense for all of the critical parties involved? With the most important one obviously being the farmers, but also a local partner involved as well. And that means looking at the value chains. Are they in place? Where to sell the produce when you talk about diversifying the productivity and the yields. So that is one, but also making sure that the environment is in place, that there are nurseries available, that the legal system at least doesn't restrict. There's the financing part of things, obviously, where we as Rabobank look at very closely. So I think it's critical, but we're also critical on whom to partner with. And that's mostly a combination of factors to look at. So for us, it's important to look at scale. So look at partners that are able to reach a certain level of scale, but also have a specific capability that is very complementary. And there's obviously multiple, and that's why we're happy to work with IDH, but also with others like the ones mentioned already. So very, very critical.
Tessa, let me come back to you. Did you want to pick up any of the points that we've heard so far on collaboration and, what are the key challenges there? Who are the key players?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's quite a few challenges, but also opportunities, as Martina was saying. Maybe to quickly come back to the question around how long does this take, right? According to the modeling that we've done. Mm-hmm. What I want to be very clear on, and that goes back to Martina's point as well, it's outcome based and it's very context specific. So you cannot just say I've implemented practice A, B, and C, and therefore I'm regenerative. That's typically not what's happening, because it really depends on where you are. So the numbers that I'm going to give also really depend on the context, and I think that was pretty clear from the question. What you're typically looking at, I would say, is somewhere between 8 to 15 years. But that as again, maybe a quick example, we've looked a bit at coffee in East Africa for smallholder farmers. And one thing that really makes a difference is the soil condition currently. So if you have a responsive soil versus if you have an irresponsive soil, and that can just differ 4 years, right? So that's just to give you an idea of thinking around the starting point, having to do a real good reflection of where am I now, and therefore how do I move? And agroforestry is a big part of that. The other part is really around soil health, I would say, and you can really move multiple ways. And typically, I would say for coffee in East Africa, what we're looking at right now, we actually have diversified systems. So it's more about optimizing the diversity and then really looking at soil health. So that's just a bit of background to showcase that it's not a one size fits all, right? It's really important to look at what is your starting point, where do you want to be, and therefore how do you move? Sure. And that makes it also so difficult to actually say, let's start doing A, B, and C, because it's never as easy as let's start doing A, B, and C. So I think that's one thing I really wanted to mention. The other thing that I would like to bring out as well is we've talked a bit about coalitions and the need to have local partners. And I would like to add there is that typically we also see a use for a landscapes approach, which means that you're not just working through the supply chain in a locality, but you're actually working on a regional basis. And that allows you to go beyond farm level or beyond supply chain level to really look at if there's multiple supply chains in an area, then how do you work with those? Can you work around landscape planning, which typically would be easier if you talk about other uses than just for agriculture? So that really helps you. And the other thing that it really does is linking up with the government. And that can be at all different levels. So you have that at the national level, you have that at the provincial level, and sometimes even the district level. But we have experienced that having the government on board can really fast track some of these changes. The challenge, on the other hand, is also that it can take a long time to get everybody on board, because you have a lot of stakeholders within such a landscape. So actually coordinating that, getting everybody aligned, getting a common set of goals, and then a common set of agreements on how to get that takes time. So we see that, yes, over time that works, but it's not something you do from today to tomorrow. So I would like to add that to the discussion as well.
So thanks, Tessa. I was going to come on to the role that the government can play in this whole debate, because clearly in terms of collaboration, they are a key partner for all of us, whether we're in the public or the private or the not-for-profit sectors. I mean, Martina, what's your stance? What's your role vis-a-vis government? How are you working with government? How are you influencing them, if that's part of your role there as a company?
I think that was me versus Martina.
Martina, I'll turn to you, Martina, first. I'll come to Martina second.
Sure, thanks. So we, again, I think absolutely critical to have the right government engagement in place, and that's not always straightforward and not always easy, but we've at Diageo, we have a strong history of working with local government across African countries in terms of building up our local raw material sourcing programs there and engaging smallholders. And that's something that we work very much with local government to demonstrate the impact that we can have through building up those smallholder programs. But I think they have a much wider role to play in creating the right conditions for regenerative agriculture to really thrive. And some of that's at a sort of a regulatory level. Some of it's just convening. I think, you know, all the massive amounts of work that's being done around COP and even the G7 that's coming up in Glasgow now. There's an awful lot of government proposals coming forward, and I think that they're really can serve to galvanize a lot of internal conversation and momentum around activities. And so I think, you know, that those, and I think the broader landscape of non-governmental and voluntary standards have a massive role. If we take a look at Mexico, where we have a big agave footprint for our tequila category, there is a tequila regulatory council that governs the technical aspects of growing of agave for tequila. And I think for me, given that the majority, I think it's you know, because it's a regulated industry, pretty much 99% of all agave is going to be governed by the rules and the regulations that the Tequila Regulatory Council apply. And that provides a platform, that provides a brilliant opportunity for us. On one hand, we can shorten our supply chain and address the issues that we have there by working directly, but actually we need, for ourselves as much as for the industry, to broaden our security of supply, to be able to have agile supply chains, and working with those industry bodies to raise all boats, I think is the opportunity I was touching on earlier. Is really the parallel approach that we need to take, because otherwise we're at risk of fixing our own problems and ignoring the rest of industry. You know, and actually what happens then if we have a crop failure within our own production or within our own supply chain? That's the flexibility and also the real opportunity of supporting that sort of economic viability in the first case, because none of this happens if the farmers aren't economically viable. We've seen very clearly the links between environmental justice and social equity, and I think that's something that we have to be mindful of as we, you know, Tessa clearly said it, farmer livelihoods. We might focus on soil, we might focus on water retention capacity and biodiversity, but actually at the heart of it has to be the farmer livelihoods, because they're the people who make it happen. And unless they've got, you know, a roof over their heads, send their children to school and can afford to feed themselves, we're asking too much. And I think that sort of brings us, you know, we've discussed little bits around the risk and reward model, and I think probably just plant that seed for further on in the conversation, because I think that's something that Martine will certainly have lots to comment on.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good chance now to bring you back into this, Martine. What's your view on that particular perspective then?
Yeah, so I think we are aligned. Might be a bit boring, but we are, I guess. So the main reason why we started doing this is because we strongly believe that in order to scale agroforestry for smallholder farmers, it's important to ensure that the farmers earn and that it's financially interesting for them. And for that, I think it's important to look at generating an additional income stream based on the fact that they are the ones maintaining the trees, which should be important for them for different reasons, but it's also helping us, all of us. So I think it's only fair to also compensate them for the carbon that they are sequestering. So that is why we think it's so important to ensure to do that. And with that, one, stimulate scale, and also ensure that you maintain the systems for a longer period of time. And government is important to a certain extent from our perspective, obviously, as well, because if you want to sell the carbon removal units to the voluntary carbon market, we at least need to be sure that there is no restrictions there from government side. So that is one. If you're looking at financing, there's always the fact that it's important to see if at least there are no restrictions. That's where we often start when we look at this from the perspective of Rabo Foundation and from the perspective of Project Acorn. So definitely something we're looking at. At this point in time, we don't necessarily play a very active role in the dialogue with the government. Again, I think it's around partnerships. So we try to reach out to partners that have a strong relationships with the government to address the things that we think are important, but also to get a good feel of what the developments are and will be.
That's great. I will stick my camera back on and join the show. Thank you very much. I've just nicked a computer of our very hard-working IT professionals. So back in the game. So thank you, Ian, for stepping into the pitch so well. I was just going to add in a little bit of insights from the previous session that we had, where some of the participants were talking about the time frame for getting payback from moving to regenerative agriculture practices have been about 6 or 7 years in some cases. And I think I've seen a lot of discussion on the chat about how regenerative agriculture is context specific. So obviously that varies in different cases. But one of the things that I think is quite tricky, I was just hearing the discussion about smallholder livelihoods, is really how do we bridge that transition gap? And Martine, I heard you talking about some of the things that we're trying to do in terms of bringing in other income streams. But again, there's a transition gap in those as well. So we've got a very interesting mixture of people on the session today, because we've got companies who are involved in supporting that transition directly themselves. They're doing it with partners like IDH that bring in public funding and sometimes impact investment style funding. But I know, Martine, when we were discussing this earlier, there are still some challenges of bringing the right type of financing in, which I thought you had some particularly interesting insights to share.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing it up, because I don't think I mentioned it very clearly, but what we do at Project Acorn is to measure the actual growth in biomass on a plot level and translate that into the amount of carbon that is being captured on plot level, and translate that into carbon removal units, carbon credits that are certified. We're looking at actual sequestration, which we think is important from a voluntary market perspective, so that companies can actually offset with their emissions from 1 year with carbon that is being sequestered in the same year. But with that, we are only compensating when there is a significant increase in biomass. And like Tessa also mentioned, most of the investments are at the beginning. So we are, with the Acorn proposition, not necessarily fixing that income or that cash flow gap, so to say. What we realize, obviously, is that if we want to make Acorn a success, and if we really want to support smallholders in that transition, access to finance will be key. So that is super important, but not something that the Acorn proposition per se is providing a solution to. However, we do see that additional income that is being generated over time can serve as an extra source of income that can help to attract financing. And we, within the Acorn team as well, play quite an active role to see, can we ensure that more access to finance will be available to finance that transition to agroforestry. And we're doing first pilots together with Rabo Foundation to test that and to see, can we provide that financing and ensure that the repayment comes from the expected carbon income that is being generated, or a combination of carbon income that is being generated combined with other sources of income. At larger scale, we would still need to work with other parties, and there's tons of parties that are interested in that, and luckily there's quite some parties that are active in that and that we're discussing further scaling up. IDH plays a role in that. There's a lot of others as well. But really, if we really want to scale this, there still is a lot of financing that is needed, and that is a bit of a challenge. And a couple of things that we tend to have a lot of discussions about. One is the tenor of the loans, like we also mentioned earlier, talking about smallholders in particular, but more generally, loan tenors of 7 or 10 years, or perhaps even longer, are scary to a lot of financiers, but that might be what is necessary here. So that is one discussion where I think if we generally want to consider financing, we need to be realistic about that. And the other side of things is interest rates and return levels, because if you're talking about such a long-term loan, and you're talking about smallholder farmers where, yes, we're trying to make this a sustainable model, but it's not going to be a model that is super profitable, where there's plenty of cash. So having a high interest rate is really going to be a challenge, and that is another discussion that we're having, and where I think it's important to have fair discussions about that. Like, if you're going to compare it with more traditional types of financial structures and return levels, we also need to talk about fair pricing and true pricing, because what are we comparing it with, right? So I think there's still a discussion to have there in the whole financial sector, and we're trying to contribute to that, but we definitely also cannot do that alone.
Thank you, Martine. And you brought up the phrase "true pricing." In one of our previous discussions, we had quite a discussion about true cost accounting, and one of the participants from a fruit and vegetable provider was talking about how they were trying to measure and monetize the ecosystem services that smallholders were providing. And I think that links to a question I've just seen on the chat from Suzanne Neve about getting wider payments for ecosystem services, not just carbon. And I think that's certainly the aspiration. We had quite an interesting conversation about that with some of the people who were trying it. But I think what I like about Project Acorn, it's carbon sequestration, but it's really focused on smallholders, and you're driving it through in a way that can be monetized and the income comes back. Because I think what we've seen in quite a lot of these types of approaches is not that much income actually comes back to smallholder farmers. And I think if we really look at the move to regenerative agriculture, it means finding income from a diversity of sources, and it means a more complex production system. And that raises a whole set of additional questions, I think, which again came through really interestingly in our previous discussions. if you're a company that's used to sourcing one particular project from a loyal base of smallholders and providing a whole, a very tried and tested set of agricultural support services, and you want to move to more regenerative agriculture practices, it changes the type of support systems that are required, and it changes the type of the variety of products that are grown. And it might mean going into collaboration with companies or value chains that you're not involved in. So we heard some really fascinating discussions about the coffee value chain, who was now looking at whether they needed to become bean traders and maize traders, because that's where the production system for their coffee producers were going, and they don't necessarily have the skills to do that. So we were hearing about things that they were trying to do. We were hearing about other companies that were trying to link up with people from different value chains. So Tessa and Martina, I wondered if you had any experiences that you wanted to share in terms of the challenges in doing that kind of agriculture, and some of the things that some of the ways you might have seen people try and overcome those.
Will I jump in first?
Absolutely.
Please do, Martina.
As I said at the outset, we're very much, I suppose, at the starting point of this journey at Diageo, so I definitely don't want to say that we've tried and tested any of these approaches, but in looking at and working with some industry-leading partners on developing out our regenerative agriculture program and the approaches, I think it comes down to risk and reward, and who takes the risk gets the reward, and there's shared models for that as well. If as a Diageo we decide to invest in supporting smallholders with provision of cover crops or inputs or mechanization, then through carbon sequestration potential credits, then we get an offsetting benefit there. In other cases, it may be that the farmer also takes some of that risk, and he has first dibs on who to sell those credits to as a consequence. There are other things, though, that can be done to help provide some level of guarantee to smallholders and other big commercial farmers. I don't think it's exclusive to smallholders at all. And I think sometimes seeing the results and actually, the model farm idea of actually witnessing what can happen and where that benefit can be transferred onto their own farms is a really powerful sort of mechanism that through that sort of farmer to farmer knowledge transfer. But actually longer term contracts, guaranteed offtake, so that we can ensure essentially against that risk. I think we've got problems potentially about protein levels coming through, and that as a brewer that can potentially have problems. But actually, if we can guarantee that we'll take that grain no matter what the conditions are, and we'll find a market for it, we also have a challenge for ourselves to maybe innovate internally so that we can allow different specifications. Or actually more broadly, if we look at regenerative, when we think about biodiversity and diversity of crops. So we all know that the over-reliance that there are on, there's various numbers bandied around, whether it be 9 or 12 crops that feed the world. Actually, are there opportunities there that would provide greater income stream for farmers because they're diversifying into specialist crops, but actually we get to potentially create a whole new category or a whole new feedstock for producing alcohol, and likewise for food companies. So I think there's actually some exciting models that can be explored there, and I think there won't be one size fits all in the same way that there won't be one size fits all for regenerative practices. We're going to have to pull the various levers because farmers are different. There's no farmer that's identical to his neighbor, and he'll have different motivations, and I think that's the challenge, but it's also the beauty of this, that we're going to have to be quite creative and innovative with how we pull those various options and what works.
Thanks, Martina. I'm going to jump back in there before Tessa, because I think that really, really builds on a conversation we were having in the sessions last week, that actually, this is a mindset shift across the entirety of the food system. And it's a mindset shift in terms of the way you work with smallholders, but the way you work with businesses and the way you work with other sectors. And we had a really fascinating conversation actually in the first session between somebody who was working directly with coffee farmers, and the person, Oliver from Kenya, who runs the partnership we've got on regenerative agriculture in the Lake Basin area, and that's got a particular focus on young people. And I'm just going to link a couple of things together. I saw some very interesting questions in the chat about how can you make regenerative agriculture work for small plot sizes, and that linked to the discussion that we were having about farmer segmentation. So Tessa, I'll bring you back in a moment, because IDH is the master of farmer segmentation, but really the farmer segmentation approach is critical, because what we see from the coffee supply chain is, even the conversation you have with a farmer that's got a slightly bigger plot size than someone else, it's a different starting point, it's a different pathway, it's a different type of mentoring. And the experience that we've had at Practical Action, which is really focusing on young people, our objective is to really revitalise the entirety of a rural economy in the Lake Basin area in Kenya. So really work to significant scale. And this is an area with really high youth unemployment, but also we all know the challenges of not so many young people wanting to go into agriculture. So actually regenerative business practices can be quite motivational, but you absolutely have to understand the constraints and what motivates people to change. And if you look at young people, they often don't have much access to land. And there's things in terms of what will keep them in the system is finding options for a relatively quick return. And that really, really influenced the supply chains that we looked at and the type of peer-to-peer mentoring that we did. So, we're working in groundnuts, tomatoes and poultry at the moment with a whole range of market interest groups to try and link these new entrepreneurs into the market. But those value chains were chosen for a particular reason for those particular group of farmers. Right, I'm now going to link back to Tessa, because I think, in terms of that farmer segmentation, what works for small farmers, larger farmers, I think there's lots that you perhaps might want to jump in on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to kind of emphasize what you were saying as well, right? It's a systems change. We're not just asking farmers to change. We want to change the system. So that means everybody needs to change, right? And farmers are at the core of that. But to enable that transition, we are all a part of that. So as Martina was saying, also means you need to source differently. So I think that's crucial. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is that also within that segmentation for farmers, you see that for specific groups to be able to transition, it's even more important that the system incentivizes them to transition. So you have farmers that are super motivated and really want to try these things, but you have a large share of farmers that are somewhere in the middle that, yes, would like to try some things, would not like to try other things. And a lot of that has to do with, again, the risk profile. So it's really important. If you have a small plot of land and your family depends on you for the income, for the children to go to school, how much risk are you willing to take? And that's a crucial question, I would say. So yes, segmentation is super important because it allows you to look at what kind of support do you offer to what kind of farmers at what kind of speed to make that transition. And that really helps. And then you can think around the types of services, which could go all the way from seedlings, inputs, training, extension services, but maybe also the opportunity to get investments to buy other plots of land, right? So extension of your farm plot. And those are typically things that you don't want to offer to all farmers, but you actually want to segment and then see for which type of farmer does it work best. So I think that's incredibly crucial. Another thing that comes in for me is that's again where the landscapes approach also works, because if one farmer is buying the plot from his neighbor, then what's the neighbor going to do? So how can you think systematically in a region how you create that transition while enabling everyone to somehow be a part of that? And that doesn't mean everybody needs to buy up the plot of land for their neighbors, because obviously that won't work. So that thinking really helps. And that for me goes back then to thinking around also finance and blended finance. So within IDH, we tend to do a lot of blended finance structures. We try to bring on board investment as well. But one of the new things that we've started to look at is how can you think around the actual blend within blended finance? Because in some areas, you might actually need more public investment, and in other areas, you might need more private investment. How can we think around things like building extension services for a region through, for example, much more the public sector that allow for that transition towards regenerative? That means you need certain governance systems, right? So, and that typically comes from public sector money. So thinking around the blend in blended finance is probably a next step that we need to consider in this as well. And again, there, if you have a whole bunch of super motivated farmers, it might be easier to do that on a different blend of finance than when you are in an area where maybe the governance systems, maybe the plots of lands are much smaller, maybe the soil is much more degraded. There you might need a different blend and less investment and more grants, for example, to make the transition. So that kind of thinking is really important, but also one that requires to have partners on board to start building those different blends, to have the data and to know what to look at in the first place, to start thinking around what kind of blend would work in this area. So yeah, it's again going back, it's a systems change.
If I can, sorry, I was just going to build a little on that concept of data as well, and about the different models, because we're asking a farmer to be so many things. He is a data engineer, he is an agronomist, he's a mechanic often. You know, we need to start looking at what are the services that he provides. And actually we need data to be able to contribute towards company level metrics around how much carbon have we offset in our supply chains, as an example. How do we compensate the farmer for the time that it takes to provide that data? And that goes beyond the smallholder. How do we look at not just the core commodity, but the ecosystem services that he is being incentivized, or we could incentivize him to do? But I think there's another piece too around incentivizing. No, we talk a lot about regenerating the land, but actually there's land that we need to stop degrading further. And how do we incentivize that positive change by, reducing deforestation and land use change? And a lot of that comes down to this basic income conversation as well, because actually the reason that encroachment on land occurs or that deforestation occurs is because they need to keep food on the table, and how do we try and cut that off first so that we don't do any further damage whilst we also, in parallel look to regenerate? I think those are some of the things that we don't necessarily always consider, but actually if we want to really drive the scale was not sort of just creating a problem further behind us, then those are things that we also need to think about in this sort of risk reward model.
Thank you, Martina. That's really helpful. I just wanted to pick up another point that's come out of the discussion. I really like the phrase you used, the thinking you were getting out at Tessa about the idea of what support services might look like in the future, and the need perhaps to have support services on regenerative agriculture that work at a landscape level or can draw on expertise that exists in that context, that's provided at least with some kind of governmental support. And there's been such a shift in extension services over the last decades, haven't there? And again, we were having a really fascinating conversation with some of the companies who've been providing support to their farmers. And as they move more into regenerative agricultural practices, the amount of knowledge, the understanding of soil health, the ability to understand crops beyond your, the one that you are expert in, just feels like it's expanding kind of exponentially for some people. And one of the participants, one of the speakers, had this phrase, where do the services stop for an individual company? And so hearing what, you're thinking about, well, can we get support services that really work in a Kenyan, in a specific context of the Lake Basin region in Kenya, or in a particular area of Tanzania or Malawi or wherever it is, seems like a route forward. But given that there has been essentially a lot of privatization of extension services, are you able to see routes to building that up again in certain areas? Is that something that's coming through in some of the opportunities from a landscape level approach?
Absolutely. We see it, for example, I'm a bit more familiar with coffee, so a lot of my examples refer to coffee, but we do see it in Vietnam, for example, where we have a landscapes approach running, and there actually the government takes up quite a big stake in getting extension services to not just address coffee, but to address multiple crops and to look at the full farm system. And actually what is nice there is we do have some data because we have been working there a bit longer, and we haven't always called it regenerative agriculture, but in essence, we've been working towards the outcomes that you would also like to see within regenerative. And what we see now is that actually the farmers working in the areas that we have been supporting them through a landscapes approach, so it's not just IDH, it's that whole coalition within the landscapes, we see that farmers use less chemical fertilizers, use less pesticides, actually sequester more carbon. But we also see with dropping prices in the last years that actually the farmers that have been part of the intervention were able to maintain higher incomes than farmers that weren't. So that is quite a nice way to see how it can link together. I don't want to claim, though, that within every landscapes approach, this will be the result, right? It's really about being able to get everybody at the table, to get willingness from everybody to move towards those goals. And that's where I would say that's really crucial within this landscapes approach. Ensure that everybody aligns to the goals that you want to reach, then everybody sees what is their own tasks within that, and then make sure you measure it. And as part of that, in this particular landscapes, the government really took up the task of extension services, especially in areas where there are harder to reach farmers. Because that goes a bit back to the point that Martina was making earlier. If you have a quite direct supply chain, then it's relatively easy to do that. But in areas that are further away, where you have less visibility on your farmers, and we also heard that in the second session for coffee particularly, there's really quite a large supply base where you don't even know which farmers you're sourcing from, then it's incredibly difficult to make that transition. And what we see in Vietnam is that typically, going back to farmer segmentation, typically the farmers that are harder to reach are the ones that are now being serviced through government. And that is really powerful. So yeah, I really see that as a strong way to move ahead, knowing all the challenges that are there in the alignment.
Thanks, Tessa. And I think there's some questions that I've seen coming in from different places around, in some places you have a policy environment that is providing at least some encouragement for these practices. In a lot of other places, the incentives are absolutely aligned the other way, and the policy environment is not really conducive to this kind of change. So, I mean, this is a question for all of our panelists. What kind of work should organisations like ourselves, like yourselves, other organisations who are part of this conversation be doing to try and address some of those policy failures? Are there any sort of top three policy changes that we should be all advocating for, people we should be focusing our attention on to get some of this change in the enabling environment? Easy question.
Difficult question. Yeah.
Please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat on this. As we've all been saying, we're trying to change a system, and the current system is obviously aligned in a particular way. So systems change is always tricky. I do think we've got some systems change experts actually in the participant list. So please put your thoughts up as well.
And I think, so I feel a bit repetitive, and it might be a bit of an easy one, but what I do strongly believe in is this true pricing, because I think it goes back to that again, right? Because if we would be able at a UN level, and for example, Rabobank and FAO and others are trying to stimulate that also in the UN Food Summit, to say we need to really look at all of the costs that are involved to be able to have a fair conversation about that. And that's also something that would then potentially also lead to having conversations at government level to say, well, if you're stimulating this, at what cost does that come, right? And I still feel that a lot of governments people will mostly be influenced by monetizing things. So if the cost of it would be higher, that might be right stimulation to move another direction. It's a super difficult thing to do. I totally realize, but I think it's worth a shot. That's one.
And I think you're right, Martina, and I do think there is more expertise at least coming through on this, and more examples. We had some great examples in the previous webinar about how a fruit and vegetable a supplier was beginning to do that and actually do that kind of true cost accounting. We had a major retailer on that session who was asking for advice about how they might get involved in doing true cost accounting. So, you know, some of that experience is really moving forward. I've just seen a comment in the chat again, and I think picking up your point, Martine, about you know, it does come down to costs, and one of the comments in the chat is about obviously the subsidization of agricultural inputs. And some of the discussions we were having in the previous session is the role of regenerative agriculture and organic fertilizer supplier, and how that can actually act as an additional income stream, again, in certain places. So, you know, shifting the way the subsidies go for those type of inputs, again, either drives the system in one way or another way.
Just to build, I suppose, from an international trade perspective, I think, you know, the role of government there in terms of encouraging a race to the top and not to the bottom is really critical, because, you know, we've seen a lot of this nationalist sort of sentiment emerging over the last number of years, and, you know, without getting into too much of the politics of it, I think it can be send out the wrong signals, and I think that we need to start using a corporate voice in an advocacy way to encourage the governments to really align minimum standards that allow, you know, that we don't kind of encourage that race to the bottom. And I think, you know, you're right, you mentioned the retailers. I think retailers and the pressure from consumers and customers is something that we're seeing an awful lot more as a branded company. And I think that has a really powerful message that sends back to governments too, because if it's coming from consumers and they can see that route through. And then the final thing I would say is, from a food security perspective, I think the imperative is there now from, you know, certainly if we look at the global south and some of the issues that they're facing, we all acknowledge, I think, that climate change and the impacts of it affect those of colour more so than those in the northern hemispheres and things. So I think to be mindful of that and to use that as a channel through to communicate with governments and the impacts of that over time in terms of their own, you know, if it's only a rise in kind of civil unrest, I think as well, those are some of the other kind of considerations at play.
Thank you. That leads into a number of other questions that have come through in the chat. But I just, Martina, it's kind of an interesting bringing up the additional vulnerabilities coming from climate change that, you know, facing that well, all of us are facing, but farmers in the global south particularly, and that's kind of a negative driver, but also potentially a driver for change, I think, as well, because one of the, you know, if you can turn our food and fit farming system round, not only does that lead to a reduction in emissions, but it changes the whole dynamic, and you know, you can have food and farming system that works much more actively for carbon mitigation and adaptation and building more resilient food systems and food security. But I wanted to link that to a couple of questions that have come through in the chat, talking about companies and farmers facing many more challenges than just regenerative agriculture. And there's a lot about incomes and livelihoods coming through. And there's an interesting question here. Is there any danger that different agendas like these compete for attention to the detriment of both? And I think I'm going to pitch in here and say, no. I think actually the approach people are taking on regenerative agriculture, if done well, should really drive positive change on incomes if we can work through the financing of the transition. And I think it was Martine, you mentioned the UN Food Systems Summit. This is a very timely webinar because we've got the UN Food Systems Summit happening tomorrow. And I know many people in this session have been involved in different ways. They have 5 action tracks, which I should be able to reel off, but I'm not going to try. But one of them is very much around incomes and livelihoods. One is about agriculture that works with nature. And if you take, and one of them is about ending hunger and food security. So if you look at those 5 action tracks and all the discussion and all the work that's gone into developing those action tracks and those pathways, the drive from the UN Food Systems Summit is that together those create, transform the food system in the way that I'm sure most of us are wanting to do on this call. So my take is that the experience that companies have had in driving sustainable agriculture, living income, livelihoods, that agenda should be reinforcing for the regenerative agriculture agenda rather than detract from it. But I'm happy to be shot down, disagreed with, or for some more nuanced perspectives to come through either in the chat or from my colleagues.
Yeah, so maybe I can quickly respond to that. I'm not going to shoot you down, absolutely not. I don't think we have a choice, to be fair. And we said it before, if you don't focus on farmer income during this transition, it will not happen. And on the same side, if you don't focus on the environmental changes that need to happen, frankly, there will not be a farm. Just talking about coffee again, in 50 years from now, less than 50 years, actually 30 years, by 2050, around 60 to 70% of current coffee lands can no longer sustain coffee growth if we don't do anything. There is no question that we need to work on both. I do see a risk, though, that this could happen, but I think the only thing we can do is be very frank about that it cannot happen, because it's going to, one way or another, affect all of it if we don't focus on the full system. So yes, I think we should be mindful to not let it happen, but I think we also have a duty that we cannot let it happen.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that almost brings us into the kind of the closing part of this session and the summing up. If anybody has burning questions for any of our participants, please put them in the chat now. We've got 15 minutes before we're going to end it for all of us. Tessa's given us a fabulous call to action there. And I do think we are at a potentially profound moment for change. One of the discussions that we've had going through this series is the drivers are coming from both ends of the supply chains. If you're in a situation facing many farmers, who don't have good livelihoods, who don't have food security, if you look at the situation in soil health and the challenges that we're going to see in that going forward, the drivers from the farming side are telling people that this has to change. And on the other side, we've got all the concerns about the climate, the analysis of the real substantially negative impact overall that our current food and farming system is having. And for those of us who've been working in different ways on sustainable agriculture with agribusinesses, the heartening thing is that we are seeing all that experience now leading to some really significant commitments around regenerative agriculture, driven by for many different reasons: concerns about biodiversity loss, concerns about climate change, net zero commitments. But these are serious, ambitious commitments from all sorts of companies, all sorts of governments, all sorts of other partners. And I think what we're trying to really do with this series is bring out some of the realities of trying to move towards this system. We've got lots and lots of organisations that want to do it, but as we've been discussing here, we're pushing uphill against a set of policy, a policy environment, a current way of doing business that makes this kind of change difficult. And we see a lot of glossy commitments, and which is great. But we have a consultancy arm at Practical Action, and one of the most common calls we're getting is from companies saying either how do we start, or we've got pilots and we're seeing this or this unanticipated consequence, or this is really challenging. How do we go from where we are to the next level? So the great thing is people are trying to do this. The challenge is it is quite complex, and there's a lot of things that we need to. And I think what we really want to do with both the series, through the series we're running, and the type of engagement we're getting through the chat, which is fabulous. I think we had 1,000 people register for this webinar, and if that doesn't tell you that there's an energy and moment for change, then I don't think anything does. And I think what we want to try and do is build on the learnings and the discussions we're having here. I can see all sorts of interactions on the chat between different organisations looking to team up, learn from each other, potentially collaborate. And that's exactly what we want to achieve. We will be sending out a questionnaire after this session to try and understand where people are in this regenerative agriculture journey, where they are getting their advice and support from, and what kind of gaps they're seeing, so that if there are interest from various people about either learning forums, additional learning events, or we can identify some geographical places, some props, some synergies between different companies where we can build some collaboration. We can try and facilitate that between us. So that's what's going to come afterwards. But I just want to give, we've got about just over 10 minutes for some final comments, questions and reflections. So I'm going to start, I think, with I'm going to go back to Martine Jansen. I'm sure there's some points or reflections that you are feeling, I wish I'd made. I want to get this over before the end of the session. So let's go to you for the first one of those.
Thanks. Yeah, and I thought this was a very interesting and also inspiring conversation, mostly because I see indeed so many people involved and so many people asking super interesting questions. So super inspiring. What I saw as a common a lot is, why do we only focus on carbon? And I think it's a very fair point. We as well try to see if we can also monetize other added values around soil health, around biodiversity. Looking at it from a Rabobank and Acorn perspective, we see compensation for carbon as a start. Just because there is a clear market for that. There is still some developments there as well. So we start there, but really hope that this is a start. More generally, if we really want to make this happen at scale, which is required, and I fully support what Tessa was saying around the urgency there, we need to look at what can we scale and try to scale that. And that is also what we're trying to do by using remote sensing data to measure, by standardizing in terms of a certification. And I think that is crucial also in other aspects. At the same, and with that, if you scale, you can reduce the cost. But that in the end, I think, and it's very important, we need to ensure that that then results in more money flowing back to the farmers. Because yes, I'm super happy with all of the positive commitments from large corporates, but I think we need to ensure that when we talk about net zero ambitions, that does result in a farmer being able to generate the credits and sustain those credits and get compensated for that. So I think we should start with that business case always to make sure that it makes sense and to sustain projects, and not to say we're planting a tree here and 2 years down the line we forgot about it. So I think that's important. Yeah, we cannot do it alone. So we're very happy to do it with a lot of other parties. We're doing a lot of pilots to see what parts can we scale in terms of agroforestry design. I saw some of the people here. Data collection, which is critical, and implementation, working with farmers, which is the starting point. And only if that is done well, the rest can follow.
Thank you, Martin. Martina.
Thanks. I guess I started by talking about the transformation of the food system, and for me, it's around 3 pillars. We have to reduce the amount of land and inputs that we require, and that's very much around how do we eliminate food loss and waste. It's about restoring the land that we are using, regenerating it through all of the applications that we've talked about today. And then it's about reinventing and redesigning that food system so that it's fit for a future that we all need it to be. And, how do we create greater value through that supply chain as well, and through that system rather, that, to Martine's point, supports the farmers and creates an inclusive environment as opposed to an exclusive one, which I think we're at risk of sometimes. Diversity is something that we're all very conscious of now, and I think across communities, but also obviously from a biodiversity perspective, absolutely right that it isn't all about carbon. We are, I think the other thing, probably the takeaway, is that none of us have the exact right answer. It is all something that we are quickly trying to learn, and I think that's where the power of collaboration can really help us go with the pace that we need to get to those, if not perfect solutions, then at least progressive ones that we can iterate and build on going forward.
Thank you. Tessa.
Yeah, I very much agree with this. I think the challenge that we're facing right now is how do we move from commitment to action? And as Martina said, we don't actually know. We don't have exact pathways that say do A, B, and C and you'll get there. So we have to figure it out, and we have to figure it out relatively quickly, and we have to figure it out together. And that's where there's so many different angles you can take, pathways. And we talked a bit about segmentation. We talked about different ways of financing. Carbon is a way to do that, but there's multiple other ways to do that. And it's really about how do we figure that out together, and how do we do that in an aligned way that we're not all reinventing the wheel, but actually we can learn from each other. And that, I think, is the crucial challenge that we're facing at this point in time.
Thank you, Tessa. So I'm just looking again at the chat. Again, all sorts of questions and reflections coming up. One of the brilliant things I'm seeing is a lot of learning being shared between people, lots of resources being passed on, lots of questions being answered. So I can see that this sort of the idea of some kind of learning network to figure it out together seems to be something that might have some value, although nobody wants to reinvent any wheels or duplicate any platforms. So we will look carefully at what we've seen in the chat, and we'll look very, very carefully at the responses to the questionnaire. But I think there is, we are at that stage where we could get ourselves into, over into a tipping point if we can build on the experience so far and get the right kind of connections at the right kind of levels. I've seen in the chat people from all over the world, from all types of crops, lots of people talking about tea, lots of people talking about coffee, a whole set of discussions about the Kenya policy environment and payment for ecosystem services, a whole set of discussions going on around soil and the drivers of biodiversity, lots of discussions about things like biochar and its potential, good questions being raised about particular crops that work in particular contexts. So it's, I guess it's exactly what we were hoping for from this session when we set it up. I think one point that I can, again, just thinking about the learning from the previous sessions we had as well. We've talked about changes that need to come in the enabling environment, and we've talked about opportunities to do that. And I think we've got some great examples of places where the environment is beginning to move on. I'm also seeing some comments in the chat about the fruit supply chain, which is great. So I can see all these different people liaising together. But I think in places where the enabling environment is not strong for that, I think what I'm also seeing is some very interesting collaborations between companies. And I've seen some really, really interesting collaborations being begun or suggested. So from people, coffee companies talking about how they might link up with the suppliers and buyers of botanical crops that work with coffee, such as ginger, linking up with organisations that are good at providing organic fertiliser, and just seeing how they can make those types of change work in a particular context and prove the point, so that then there is more evidence to have an impact on the enabling environment. One of the things that we're doing in Kenya through our work, which is funded by the IKEA Foundation, who are a big funder of, I think, quite a lot of regenerative agriculture projects, is also trying to really demonstrate the business case. And I think that's probably coming through in a number of people's pieces of work and a number of the comments we're getting about data and analysis and economics. And I think the more we can pull out the data, the economics, being very honest though about what does and doesn't work and where the economics are not stacking up and how to finance that gap, the more likely we are to be able to bring more people along in the journey. So I'm going to close that session here. Just a big thank you to everyone who's participated. I really appreciate the level of engagement, the expertise, the comments, the questions. A huge thank you to all of our participants who've taken the time and being, and when we started this session, there was, some nervousness, I think, from all the speakers through all the 3 sessions we've done, about feeling that nobody wanted to set themselves up as someone, who had the answers to this very, very difficult sector-wide transformation puzzle. So the fact that people are willing to come in and discuss this, really where we are now, really the realities, I think we are going to be in a much better place to build some collaborations and approaches that take us to the next step. I'm also really pleased to see the engagement on the chat. So that gives me a huge amount of positivity for the future. I think we've got people from all different kinds of organisations in many different countries and all parts of the value chain. And that's what we need if we're going to make this transition happen. Some of us are also very linked into these policy forums like the UN Food Systems Summit, and we need to play our roles there. And I think the discussion on the chat about obviously making sure the farmer is always central to this and involved in the discussion is to make sure that those voices come out loud and clear. I've seen one final question, actually, which I think is such a good one that perhaps we should end on that. Given your experience, and this one is particularly focused from one country, but I think I'm going to take it away from the country and say, given your experience in working with farmers, do you have one thing that you've seen as being particularly beneficial to them in making the change?
I'm just going to stick with a minimum income. I think that in itself is such a potentially powerful platform from which to allow farmers to have choices to do the right thing environmentally and socially. So I'm going to, keep it with that.
Okay. Tessa, you look like you might want to say something here.
Yeah, it's a really good question and not an easy answer. I fully align with Martina that income is very much the underlying driver that needs to be addressed. I think the second one that we tend to forget, including ourselves as IDH, is it has to be very inclusive. So it shouldn't be, we have thought about for this region, A, B, and C is what you need to do. Now, how do we ensure that we listen to what actually works for the farmers? And I think that's something that we tend to forget in all our enthusiasm to get this done.
I think that's a great reflection, Tessa, and that links to what I was going to say actually, because some of the most interesting discussions we also had in the first two sessions was how some of these practices are linking back to, you know, previous practices that many farms might have had, perhaps before they got more engaged in specific value chains. So there were some really, really interesting discussions about how support providers were really engaging with farmers to understand the type of cover crops either they were already using or they were used to using, the type of intercropping that farmers were doing or had done in the past, and trying to build the regenerative practices out of experience that either was already there or had been there previously. And I think that also gives a sense of hope for the future, because it does link into that broader, resilient, diverse farming system that has been critical in the past. And if we can link what we see in terms of the overall transformation in the food and farming system to approaches that are already really supported or can build on, then I think we're in a good position. But that the importance of listening to farmers and understanding that what works for one set of farmers may not work for another set of farmers, I think is absolutely critical. And that probably is a really good place to leave it. Although, looking at the questions and the comments, we could probably go for another hour and a half. So that makes me think that we will reflect on what we've heard, and if we think there are specific angles or specific sessions to run in the future, we will put some more of these on. But we will also really look at how we can build some serious momentum and new collaborations in different parts of the world with some of these fabulous participants in terms of actually taking the learning into practical action on regenerative agriculture. So thank you very much for all your time, everyone. I'm going to close the session now, and we will follow up and make sure that we build on this learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.